Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. Welcome, and we are here for today's webinar, Strategic Climate Communication, Insights and Tools for Effective Strategies. We're so glad to have you all with us today. Before we get started, I just want to mention a few housekeeping notes to help everything run smoothly. If everyone can please, keep your microphone muted during the presentation just to avoid any interruptions while our presenter is speaking, that would be great. We also kindly ask that you remain respectful to our presenters and fellow attendees throughout the session. We will reserve some time at the end for Q&A. We will be monitoring the chat throughout the session, so if you have any questions during the presentation, feel free to just drop those questions in the chat, or during the Q&A time, you can unmute yourself and ask your question. Additionally, a recording of today's webinar along with the presentation slides will be shared with everybody who registered, and we'll also be posting it to the SLI website. So without further ado, let's get started. It's my pleasure to turn things over and introduce our speaker, Mallika Talwar. Mallika is from the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication. She's going to share how libraries can use data and research to better understand their communities and communicate about climate change more effectively and inspire local action. Welcome, Mallika. Thank you for being with us, and we're excited for the presentation.
Thanks so much, Alex. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. I would love it, before we kind of get started, I would really love it if you could take a moment to just share your names and your organization in the chat, and also take about 30 seconds to answer this one question. And thank you to the one person who has already answered. Sarah, thank you for that. But yeah, just take a moment to reflect on, when you think about climate change, what do you feel? And please share that in the chat, if you don't mind. So we saw anxiety right off the bat, seeing a helplessness, lots of helplessness. I definitely feel that. 2, sadness, overwhelmed. Frustration, absolutely. It's funny because I feel like I cycle through many of these in any given day. Snail's pace, yep. Okay, thank you for sharing, and take your time to respond to this, but I'll move on to the next question. Seeing some worry as well, thank you. Sorry, here, okay. Next question. When you think about climate change, how do you want to feel? Same deal, please share your responses in the chat. Hopeful. Yep. Plus wanting that. Proactive, optimistic, also hopeful. Like I can do something to make a difference. Yes, I feel that so deeply. Okay. Again, feel free to keep adding if you need to. And then last question, and this one is a two-parter. When you talk about climate change, what do you want your audience to feel? And what do you want them to do? So you could do like feel and do in the chat. And it would be good if you respond with just as one comment, so we know both. Hopeful, we want them to have clear actions that they can do, feel empowered, take action. Thank you for sharing. Very similar themes: feeling informed, feeling hopeful, taking action, care. We want them to care and we want them to do their part. Yes. We want them to feel empowered, informed, and hopeful, feel engaged. We want them to feel challenged, and action, we want them to get actively involved. Okay, great. Thank you so much for sharing. I know that it's not always easy to talk about how we're feeling about many things, especially right now. So I really appreciate you taking a moment to do that. I think that it's always helpful to start by surfacing the challenges that we face as people who are interested in communicating about climate change. That chasm that we saw between how we feel and how we want to feel, and how we want others to feel and what we want them to do, and ultimately how we convert these feelings into action, is the challenge that we are all grappling with, right? This big gap between where our feelings are at and how we want to feel. And that is the point of today's presentation. Hopefully, after this presentation, you will feel slightly more equipped and slightly more confident to bridge this gap, despite all the bad news and difficult things that we are all facing. The hope is that you are equipped with some tools and some data and some strategies to help bridge this gap. So, hi, everyone. Slightly delayed introduction. Thank you for joining. My name is Mallika. I'm the Deputy Partnerships Director at the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication. We sometimes call ourselves YPCCC because Yale Program on Climate Change Communication is such a mouthful. So if you hear me saying that, YPCCC, that's what I'm referring to. I come from a background in community-based marine and coastal conservation, as well as environmental campaigning. And in all of these different roles that I played in my career, communication has been a central piece. And so I'm really excited to talk to you all today about strategic climate communication and the role that you all can play and that libraries can play as local leaders in climate communication and in sustainability. So I'll start with a quick introduction to YPCCC and who we are and what we do. We are a research center at the Yale School of the Environment, and we study what people think, feel, and believe about climate change. So essentially, we do scientific studies on public beliefs, opinions, attitudes, and behavior as they relate to climate change. I'm representing the partnerships team today, and the focus of our team is to help people like yourselves, people who are leaders in climate communication and leaders in their communities, advocates, businesses, educators, governments, and anyone really who's looking to communicate on climate change. My role is to help groups like that better understand our research and apply it in their work so that they can effectively build public and political will for climate action. This is a quick roadmap of what I'm hoping to cover today. We'll start with talking about what the goal of effective climate communication is and should be. We'll then move into Americans' views on climate change. And in that section, we'll explore some of our research, some of our tools. And then we'll talk about how we can apply that research to develop effective strategies for communication. We'll close out with a case study of an example of how an organization has applied this research in their work. And then I'll quickly just talk about how you can partner with us and follow up. So let's get started. For us, and the vision of YPCCC is essentially to build public and political will for climate action. And the reason for this is that climate change is a massive collective action problem, right? And it requires us to do these two things. It requires us to build public will, and it requires us to build political will. By public will, I'm talking about a social system's shared recognition that this problem exists, that it is a problem that deserves to be addressed, as well as people at large feeling like they can do something to address it and people taking the actions to address it, right? So that's the public will piece of it. In our theory of change at YPCCC, we also see that public will can lead to political will. Of course, we need people to take actions in their own lives and to make behavior change, to address climate change. But ultimately, because this is a collective action problem, we need people's concern to translate into political will. We need to move our elected officials, government officials, decision makers at all levels to actually enact policies that will lead to large-scale change. right? And so we need both. We've seen this theory of change in action before, right? In the history of the United States, we've seen large-scale sort of public will translating into political will. If we go back to the first Earth Day that happened in 1970, we saw millions of Americans taking to the streets to observe Earth Day and to mobilizing to demand action to protect our environment. And we know that all of this mobilization and the effort of all of these people led to landmark legislation like the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, the formation of the EPA, these bedrock policies that have protected our air, water, and communities from environmental harm. So the question is, what does it take to create this kind of change, this large-scale public and political will? Some of us might think that that is the job of organizers, activists, people mobilizing on the streets. And you're right, and I agree, that is the job of all of those people. And so the question is, what are libraries doing here, right? For creating a sustained movement that actually leads to change, we also need this sort of sustained narrative shift, right? And maintaining that and creating that requires many, many trusted messengers across different sectors, across different geographies, leaning into their power to educate and engage audiences and to move them from concern to action. And that is the role that we're going to focus on today, right? That is the role that we can all play in building public and political will. And we can do that through effective communication. So let's talk about how we can all communicate effectively to build narrative momentum. So any effective communicator knows that the first rule of communication is to know your audience. Knowing your audience allows you to understand them and to meet them where they are at, rather than where we are at, right? Or where you are at. And this is important because your audience will not and may not need to think about climate change the way that you do. For instance, I care about climate change because I love that we're so lucky to be blessed with such incredible, charismatic megafauna who would be impacted by climate change, right? But someone else may not care about moose the way that I do, right? Someone else may be worried about the impacts of climate change on future generations, on their children, on the health of their children. And someone else might be worried about the impacts on the economy, how we power our homes, how we heat our homes, jobs. Someone else might be interested in, how we can get good paying jobs for our communities. And so we really need to understand our audience and understand what matters to them so that we can communicate to them in ways that actually make sense to them, right? And we can get them to care about climate change because of the impacts of climate change on the things and the people, places, and things that they care about. So a great place to get started if you want to understand your audience here in the US and to understand your audience's views on climate change, is our Climate Change in the American Mind survey. This is a twice yearly nationally representative survey that we conduct in partnership with the George Mason University Center for Climate Change Communication. And we've been conducting these surveys twice every year since 2008. So we've been able to track Americans' shifting beliefs on climate change since then. And these reports essentially study what Americans believe about climate change, what their attitudes are, how they're perceiving the risks associated with climate change, and also their policy support when it comes to climate change. So I'll spend the next few minutes kind of diving into some key findings from this research. And the very first one is about the percentage of Americans who believe that global warming is happening. Does somebody want to guess what percentage of Americans think that global warming is happening? And you can drop your guesses in the chat. Okay, seeing 75% on one end, 16% on the other end, 50% in the middle. Okay, so quite a diverse set of responses here. Any other last guesses? 30%? Okay, so really across the spectrum. Great. Wonderful. This is why I'm doing this training. So some of you were bang on, correct. 7 out of 10 Americans think that global warming is happening. And only 15% of Americans think that it is not happening. So that's some good news. A majority of Americans think global warming is happening. Majority of Americans also think that global warming is mostly human caused. You can see that's about 60% as of our latest survey. And this is lower than the percentage who think it's happening, but it's still a majority, right? As opposed to 28% who think it's mostly natural changes in the environment. And you can see how these percentages have changed over time. A majority of Americans are also worried about global warming. So you can see here that about 65% of Americans report being either somewhat or very worried. And in fact, when you zoom into that sort of dark green bar at the bottom, that's the percentage who report being very worried. We see that almost a third of Americans are very worried about global warming. And this percentage has essentially doubled in the last decade. So if we go back to March 2015, we're seeing about 11 to 15%. We're seeing almost 30% now. So what we're seeing is this trend towards increasing worry about global warming. Now, that was all mostly good news, right? A majority of Americans think it's real. They're worried about it. The worry in general is increasing. There's a trend towards increasing worry. But the challenge with global warming and climate change is that there is a psychological distance associated with it. What I mean by that is that people tend to think that, yeah, okay, it is real, but it's going to impact polar bears in the Arctic, or people in developing countries, or future generations, but not us right here, right now, and not the people, places, and things that we care about right here and right now. So what we're finding in our research is that Americans are starting to make the connection that climate change does impact them personally, right? We're seeing about 46% saying that it does impact them a moderate amount or a great deal. But many more think that others will be harmed, right? And so we're seeing this psychological distance kind of persisting still. As I said, Americans are starting to connect the dots to see how climate change actually impacts them. We're starting to see that a majority of Americans think global warming is affecting extreme weather events or related impacts in the US, especially when it comes to extreme heat. You can see the numbers here. You're seeing the vast majority of people think that global warming is affecting extreme heat. So far we saw Americans were worried. They're starting to make the connection that climate change impacts are real, that they are here, they're now. And yet, what we find is that most Americans rarely or never discuss global warming with family and friends. So 65% say that they rarely or never discuss it, as opposed to 35% who say they often or occasionally do so. And the reason for this is that Americans aren't perceiving social norms for acting on global warming, right? There's 2 pieces to this. One is that we find that people consistently underestimate how many others around them care about global warming. And we saw some of that in the chat a while ago, right? That's totally normal. Most of us think, oh yeah, I'm really worried, but others just don't care. And I wish I could just get them to care, right? And so we consistently underestimate how many others around us care. And we don't perceive social norms. We don't think that we don't see others around us taking action or talking about global warming. And what this leads to is the spiral of climate silence. So we don't talk about it because we think, okay, others don't care, so what's the point? And I don't want to, stick my neck out and talk about this like controversial or, polarizing issue. And then because we don't talk about it, the people around us who take cues from us because they love and respect us don't see those cues, right? And don't think that it's something that's important to us. And so then they don't talk about it. And so on and on that goes, this sort of spiral of climate silence. Part of this climate silence also is that Americans are not hearing about global warming in the media, right? Very few report hearing about it at least once a week or at least once a month. And in fact, recently, in our most recent survey, we're seeing that reportage about climate change is kind of declining. And so even fewer people are hearing about climate change. And part of the reason for this is this sort of perceived political shift, right? Where we think that, okay, people don't actually care about climate change because of the current sort of political environment and the political climate. But in fact, our research shows that most registered voters support many climate friendly energy policies, whether that is regulating carbon dioxide as a pollutant, or whether that's giving tax credits or rebates to encourage people to take actions that reduce carbon pollution, or transitioning the US economy. All of these enjoy majority support. And you can see that there's quite a bit of support across the political spectrum. And this is more relevant now, a large majority of registered voters also oppose eliminating programs related to global warming. So they're opposed to directing federal agencies to stop providing information about global warming. They don't support, many Americans don't support eliminating the Federal Emergency Management Agency, right? Okay, so those were national averages, right? So that's for Americans at large. But most of us are not communicating with Americans at large, right? Especially with libraries, these are hyper-local institutions that serve a local community. So a question you might have is, okay, this is all well and good, but like I am in a rural area, or I am in this in an area where I don't think people really care about climate change. So how do I understand what my communities think about climate change? So lucky for you, at YPCCC, we've designed this tool called the Yale Climate Opinion Maps. These are interactive maps that are publicly available on our website, and I've included the link here, that you can use to explore public opinions about climate change at the state level, at the congressional district level, for counties, and for metro areas. And so you can use these maps to select the questions that you're interested in from our Climate Change in the American Mind survey, and select the geographies of interest for you, so your state, your county, and see what the opinions are like in your state or in your area. We also have the Yale Climate Opinion fact sheets. They're essentially the same as the climate opinion maps, except they're customizable. So you can select your geography of interest. You can select the questions that you are interested in, and it essentially summarizes all of that information into this like handy dandy little fact sheet that you can print and make available to your community and help people see what opinions look like in their own community. Okay, so let's pause here, and I'd love to hear some reflections in the chat about what is surprising you, and how is this changing how you're thinking about communicating on climate change. So feel free to take a moment to just share your thoughts in the chat. Anything that you felt was new or surprising? Okay, seeing it hasn't hit home for many people yet. Yep, that's true. I think that was surprising or new. Important to remember, we all have different reasons for being concerned about climate change. Absolutely. Surprised to learn that so few people talk about it. Yeah, it is shocking given the levels of worry and concern. Pleasantly surprised by 70%. Yay, that's what I'm here to do. Definitely surprised at the number of people who support climate change. Yep. This makes the idea of a conversation more realistic. Yeah, thank you for sharing. Absolutely. That is the point of sharing this data, is helping people feel empowered to communicate, right? Helping people see that, oh, okay, they're not alone and that they can take action. Great. Feel free to keep adding. I'm going to keep us moving, but thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. Yay, you already feel less hopeless just with this information. Great. That is the point. Okay. So before we paused, we talked about geographic differences in belief in and support for climate action. But even within any one geography, if you take any state, if you take any district, or let's just say even any city, we know that the people are really different, right? Even on a neighborhood block, there are so many different people. And they have diverse ways of approaching the issue, right? So what I find is that we often make the mistake of assuming that there are two factions. There's on one side, there are the people who support climate action, and then on the other side, and so those are the activists, and on the other side, you have the opponents. But our data actually finds that Americans don't divide neatly into climate activists and opponents, right? In fact, Americans respond to the climate issue in many different ways. Our research identifies global warming 6 Americas. These are 6 audiences within the American public that each respond to the issue in their own way. So here are the 6 Americas, and they are arranged from left to right in decreasing order of belief in, concern about, and motivation to act on global warming. So on one end, we have the alarmed. The alarmed, as the name suggests, are alarmed about climate change. They think human-caused global warming is real. They're concerned. They're motivated to act. But important to note, just because they're motivated to act doesn't mean that they're already taking action. In fact, most of them are not, and most of them are wondering how they can get involved. Do solutions exist? Does it even matter? Like, do we even have time? Is there hope? So those are the alarmed. Next, we have the concerned. The concerned also think that human-caused global warming is happening. They think it's a serious threat. They support climate policies. But for them, that psychological distance still persists. They think, okay, yeah, it is a threat. Yes, it's real, but it's not the most urgent threat. It's not going to impact me right now. There are other things to worry about. Next up, we have the cautious. The cautious haven't yet made up their minds. They're wondering, is it real? Is it not real? Is it human-caused? They're unsure. Then the disengaged. The disengaged know little about global warming. They rarely or never hear about it in the media, and they're generally very hard to reach. And then the last 2 audiences, this is where we're coming into the denial space, right? So the doubtful don't think that global warming is happening, or if they think it is, they think it's a natural cycle. It's not human caused. In any case, they don't think too much about the issue or consider it a serious risk. And then finally, the dismissive are those who are convinced that it's not happening. They think it's a hoax. They endorse conspiracy theories. And the difference between the doubtful and the dismissive is that the dismissive actually do spend a lot of time thinking about it and talking about it. They're pretty loud. And so they're pretty highly engaged, but they're convinced that it's not real. So they, espouse conspiracy theories. So in the chat, does someone want to guess which of these segments is currently the largest segment of the American population? And no cheating. These answers are on the internet. So, okay, I'm seeing cautious, lots of cautious, disengaged, okay, concerned, okay. Lots of cautiouses, okay, so most people think people are undecided. Great. Okay, I am going to share the answers with you. So as of our latest survey, we find that the largest segment are actually the concerned. They're 28%. But the alarmed are not far behind. And 26 and 28% are statistically indistinguishable. So I would say they're kind of tied for first place. And what's important to note is that together they make up a majority of Americans. So majority of Americans are either alarmed or concerned. And our strongest opponents, the dismissive, are only 10% of the population. It's just that they're so loud and they take up so much space that it feels like there's many more of them than there actually are. Oh, great. Some right answers right at the end before I check. Great. And what we're seeing is this trend towards alarm, right? We're seeing that over the last decade, the alarmed have increased by 11 percentage points. And we're seeing fewer people, like the trend is towards increasing alarm, essentially. Now, because the 6 Americas are so different in the ways in which they approach the issue, when we ask them, if you could ask just one question to an expert on global warming, what would it be? We find that they have different answers, obviously, right? So the alarmed and concerned are wondering, what can we do? What solutions are out there? How can I plug in? Is there still time? Whereas the cautious and the doubtful are wondering, how do you know it's human caused? How do you know if it's real, right? And is it really happening? So because the Six Americas approach the issue in such different ways, our strategies for engaging them have to be really different, right? With the alarmed and the concerned, we need to emphasize messages that help connect them to the solutions that already exist, that connect them to the solutions in their own communities, at the state level, at the national level. We need messages that empower them and help them feel confident that they can take action and that their actions matter, right? With the concerned, cautious, and doubtful, we need to focus on education. We need to help them see that human-caused global warming is real, it's happening, and it's a serious threat, and it's going to impact them and the people, places, and things that they care about, right? You'll notice that I did not include the dismissive here, and I did that purposely. There's a reason for that. The dismissive are so set in their ways and so set in their opinions about climate change that it can be really counterproductive and really not effective to try to engage them. In fact, it can be a huge time suck. It can take a lot more money than we have to actually shift their beliefs. And in fact, it can even lead to backlash, right? So in general, our suggestion is to focus our efforts on the rest of these audiences. And if there's just one thing you do, I would say the low-hanging fruit here is to engage the alarmed and the concerned, because they're already worried, and convert their worry into action, right? That, if we're able to do that, that's like over 50% of Americans. That's what we need to actually build a movement, right? At the same time, we need the silent permission of the concerned, cautious, and doubtful, so that when policymakers and decision makers take actions to address climate change, they can know that they're not going to be punished for the actions that they take. So we need the silent permission of the concerned, cautious, and doubtful, knowing that not everyone is willing to get involved and be out on the streets and calling their members of Congress. But if we can shift their opinions and make sure that they're at least not punishing any actions, that will get us to where we need to go. Okay, so really quickly, those are the Six Americas. And if you're wondering, where do my library visitors and members fall in the Six Americas, we have a tool, again, a publicly available tool called the Six Americas Super Short Survey, or SASSY, which is a name that I really love, that you can use. It's just a 4-question survey, and you can use it to segment any person or any group into the Six Americas and see where they fall in the Six Americas. It's available on our website. We also have a group scoring tool, so you can run the survey and upload the data, and it'll tell you what percentage of your audience falls into the Six Americas. Okay, so I talked about a lot of data just now. Now let's talk about how we can translate that, how we can translate these tools and this research into effective communication strategies. So there are 3 main factors that determine how impactful our communication will be, right? It's our messenger, it's our message, and how we communicate the message to our audience, or how we reach our audience, right? Which determines how many people actually are engaged. For today's conversation, I'll be focusing mostly on messenger and message. Their reach really depends on where you're at and what the size of your audience is, whether you're communicating on social media or in person. I have less to say about that, so I'm going to focus more on the messengers and the messages. So you may have heard of the saying that the messenger is the message. And I would say that when it comes to climate communication, this is largely true. The best designed messages can fail if they are not delivered by the right messengers, right? And trusted messengers can really make or break your communication strategy. If we are relying on people that are not relatable to your audience, that feel distant and that feel like they're not trustworthy, your audience is less likely to be open to the messages that you are sharing. So, of course, who is a trusted messenger depends on your audience, right? Different people will trust different messengers depending on their value system, depending on who they trust, essentially. But I will say that in general, people like and trust others who are like them. So finding and championing our allies in different communities, in different geographies, working in different spaces is very important if we want to engage a diverse audience. But I also want to just take a moment to point out that libraries themselves continue to be extremely trusted institutions in our low trust era, right? We're seeing that there's very low trust in the media, there's very low trust in like social media and elected officials, of course, and politicians. But we know from surveys and data that Americans continue to trust public libraries and as a space for finding reliable information, right? And some of this research is a little dated. I think the Pew survey that I found was from 2017, and a lot has happened since 2017. But that survey found that 78% of Americans said that they trusted libraries to help them find reliable information. So we need libraries, and we need library leaders like yourselves to lean into this and to communicate on climate change. So one example that I'll highlight of an effective way to use a trusted messenger is a campaign or a project that we did in partnership with New Climate Voices. This is their New Climate Voices campaign, where by using trusted messengers like Air Force General Ron Keyes and values-aligned messages like the national security threat of climate change, we found and we tested and found that the campaign was able to shift Republican views on climate change through targeted advertising, right? And so what you need to think about when you're choosing trusted messengers is, of course, trust, like who does your audience trust, but also think about what relationships they have. Think about diversity, right? Diversity of voices, variety, as well as one thing I think that is really important for libraries is local messengers. People are much more likely to trust their neighbor, their friends, people they recognize in their community, rather than just some like talking head on the TV, right? Okay. So that brings us to messages. And while messages are really, really important and get us most of the way to where we want to go, messages, we need really well-designed messages as well to back up our communication strategy. What we find when it comes to climate communication is that too much of climate communication involves the use of jargon and abstract concepts like emissions and tons of carbon and future impacts and things like that. What we need is a simple message repeated often so that it sticks, right? As much as we can simplify our messages, as much as we can help our SEO audiences, that the impacts of climate change are right here, right now, and that the solutions are also right here, right? And as much as we can simplify that and repeat it is going to help us create messages that are effective, right? So one such simple message that we know works because we've tested it time and time again is the scientific consensus message. So essentially saying that 97% of climate scientists, actually this has now been updated to 99%. So 99% of climate scientists have concluded that human-caused global warming is happening. There is no debate. The debate is settled. Many people, you would be surprised by how many people falsely think that it's actually a 50-50 split, and there's like a lot of scientific debate on this. Just simply stating that there is no debate and that 99% of climate scientists have concluded that this is happening and it's human-caused, actually not only increases belief that global warming is real, it's also gateway belief. And so it actually increases people's likelihood of engaging in climate action and taking action. And this is an especially effective message for audiences, for persuading audiences, so audiences like the cautious. We also know from our research that there are these 6 key truths that we've simplified that are very effective at building support for climate action. So these 6 key truths are: it's real, it's us, experts agree, so the scientific consensus, it's bad, The impacts are serious and urgent, and they're happening right now. Others care, so you're not alone, and that there's hope, that solutions exist, right? And just these simple messages with just few words, actually, if we just repeat them often, actually have been shown to increase support. We talked about the psychological distance of climate change, right? About how it feels too far ahead, too far in the future, or impacting other people. We need communication that connects the dots and helps people see that climate change is actually an everything, everywhere, all at once issue. It's impacting everything from the price of coffee, which many of us depend on to start our day, to health effects on people, to effects on our economy. So people need to see how climate change is impacting the people, places, and things they care about. In the context of a library, I spent some time on Yale Climate Connections, which is our online news media platform. And I pulled out some stories that actually connect the dots between what libraries are doing in the face of climate change, right? So helping people see how climate change is impacting their own local community and how libraries can step in and the roles that libraries can play to address it. These are all good ways of connecting the dots and making the issue make sense for your audiences. By the way, Yale Climate Connections is a great story bank. You can see, we actually have a map that you can use on Yale Climate Connections to find stories from different regions and different areas. So these are local stories. Facts and figures are all well and good, but if we want to win people's hearts and minds, we need to move them with emotionally resonant storytelling that establishes the urgency of climate change and helps people see that solutions exist. So we need stories about real people, not just abstract concepts, not just greenhouse gas effect. We need to talk about, what does this mean for the people in our community? What does this mean for people who are taking action? Like, we need people to feel inspired and moved. And we want people to feel hope, right? And so speaking of hope, our partners at Potential Energy tested many different message frames to see what persuades people. And they looked at message frames that were highlighting the health benefits of climate change. They looked at economic benefits, and all of these different frames. And essentially what they found was that, and they tested them, by the way, in like across countries, across the G20 and a few more other countries. And what they found was that among all the message frames, the ones that stood out the most were the ones that emphasized that we need to address climate change to protect the planet and to protect future generations. We need to make sure that our children have the opportunity to enjoy all the things that we got to enjoy, right, in our childhood. The other frames were also effective, but just not as effective as this one. And we call this message actually, later is too late to protect the planet and future generations. So again, we're seeing that like emotionally resonant storytelling that talks about what's at stake here. We're going to lose the things we love. That actually is the most effective. In the US, I think combining cost savings with the environmental benefits is a winning message, especially when we're talking to conservative audiences and Republicans. It's actually a winning strategy to combine these together so that we're able to speak to a more diverse audience. And especially when it comes to conservatives, I know this is on the top of a lot of people's minds. What we find is that the most effective messages are those that are educational, rather than those that are like, it's a crisis, like we're going to lose everything, act now. Actually, those crisis frames can lead to a lot of backlash amongst conservatives. So we need to highlight informational, educational messages. And this is actually a superpower for libraries, right? Because people are coming to libraries to learn, right? And they think of libraries as reliable sources of information. So we needed to emphasize these educational messages. And then lastly, we need to build social norms. That is one of the biggest barriers towards people taking action. And the way to do that is to emphasize the widespread support that exists for climate action, right? Here's an example of a partner of ours, the Alliance for Climate Education. They used our data in their ads to recruit teachers to teach about climate change. And so you can see this is a social norm in action. They're building a social norm. They're saying, hey, 8 in 10 American adults think that students should learn about climate change at school. And so you're helping teachers who might see this ad see that this is something that is a need in their community, that people support. And the second piece of this is helping people feel that their actions matter. This is something we call collective efficacy. People need to see that if they take action, that will create an impact. So this is a screenshot from that same Alliance for Climate Education ad. They go on to say, as an educator, you have the power to equip young people with the tools they need to take action. And we tested these ads as well, and we found that these ads were much more effective than anything else that ACE ran with their audiences at actually recruiting teachers to sign up for their program. Okay, I'm going to take the next 4 minutes to just quickly run through a case study of how another trusted institution leaned into its power to tell effective climate stories and how they used our research and data in the process. So I'm going to talk about the Weill Center. The Weill Center is a natural history museum in Tupper Lake, New York. That's upstate New York, a rural Republican congressional district. And they are a natural history museum. And back in 2020, they decided they received a grant or they decided that they wanted to create an exhibit on climate change. But they were worried that given their location and their audience, that a climate exhibit actually wouldn't land well with their audience. There would be backlash, that there were different priorities for the audience. So they reached out to us and they asked us for some help on this. By speaking to us, they realized that the best way to actually find out where their audience kind of fell on this issue was to survey them using the Six Americas Super Short Survey. So the Weill Center worked with the Carer Collective, which is an evaluator for museums, and they administered the SASE survey to visitors. But before they administered this survey, they asked their staff to essentially say what they think the results of the survey would be, right? And so what you can see here in blue are the staff's assumption of where their visitors would be on the Six Americas. And in orange, you see what they actually found when they ran this survey. And what they found was that many more of their visitors were alarmed or concerned than they thought, right? In fact, they were so taken aback by these results that they didn't trust these results. And they said, let's run the survey again, and let's run it in the winter when the audiences are more local. They were like, oh, these are people from elsewhere traveling to Tupper Lake in the summer, so let's do it in the winter. They ran it again in the winter and essentially found the same results again. And this gave them not only did it give them the confidence to design a climate exhibit, but they focused their exhibit on climate solutions, because they said, okay, our audience is mostly alarmed and concerned. And what do the alarmed and concerned need? They need information about solutions. So they designed their climate solutions exhibit around this big idea. The big idea was people across sectors, generations, and backgrounds are building a web of climate solutions, and they are inviting all of us to find our place in the climate movement. They used a storytelling approach. They decided they didn't want to go into the science and they didn't want to do that. They felt that stories hold more power to move hearts and minds, and they wanted to inspire their visitors to take action because they were alarmed and concerned. And they also followed the Weill Center's guardrails while talking about climate change solutions. They just offered options without using any sort of like, you should do this or you should do that, right? So they anchored the exhibition around these 12 large format portrait photographs depicting people working in the Adirondacks region. So these are local climate champions, right? Who are taking action on climate change. And you can see, and so they essentially included the stories of these local climate champions. And you can see that in the choice of the people they chose to highlight, you're seeing racial diversity, you're seeing diversity in terms of age, generation, you're seeing careers and sectors. So you're helping people imagine how they themselves can fit in, whether you're a musician or you're a solar project manager or you're a farmer. How can you plug in and how can you take action? They did an evaluation of the exhibit, and essentially what they found was that using a climate solutions framework was clear and effective. Visitors left the exhibition feeling hopeful. Many of them felt that they felt more positive about the future of climate change. They had people who said, "Oh, the practical solutions that you presented were just so helpful. It helped them feel like there are things that I can do, right?" And they found the stories of the people relatable, those personal stories of people finding their way into climate change action. So this mix of practical solutions, relatable profiles, and locally grounded examples all contributed to the feeling of hopefulness because it fostered this sense of progress, which is often lacking in the ways that we talk about climate change. I'm going to just stop talking now. I've been talking forever, and I'm going to open it up for questions with that. So thank you so much. And I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Anyone with questions, feel free to drop them in the chat, or if you want to unmute and ask away, go for it.
Hi, I have a question. My name's Christine from Springfield, Vermont, and we are pursuing our, you can hear me, right? Cool. We're pursuing our sustainable certification, which is great. But as I come in every day and check my emails on my listserv and listen to what's going on in the world, and especially in the library world, I'm hearing a lot about AI as a tool and how much it's grown. But then I go home and my children are telling me how horrible it is for the environment, and I know some of that to be true. So I feel like I'm in a position where I would like to find out more and educate the community about the impacts of AI on the environment. Do you have any suggestions?
Great question, and I think is definitely top of mind for many people. We have not studied AI specifically and like how to communicate about AI, so I don't know that I have too many solutions or too much advice on that. I would say that like keeping it educational and not judgmental is always helpful. So helping people understand, right, like connect the dots, right? Like what we talked about here. What is the impact here? And I think dialogue as opposed to just sort of one-way conversation is always also helpful. So those are things I would just say off the top of my mind. These are not things that have been tested. But if there are others here who have thoughts on how to address that, please chime in. I'm not an expert on this for sure. Yep.
Yeah, thanks so much. As people have said in the chat, this has been really helpful, but I'm feeling like I've got so much information. Do you have any suggestions, like if we visit your website, what's a good place to get started?
Yeah, absolutely. So what I can definitely do is I will be sharing the slides and I'll follow up with some links. I would say that the best place to get started are our Yale climate opinion maps. I'm going to just drop the link in the chat. You're not seeing my screen, are you?
No, not now.
Okay. I'm going to drop it in the chat, and I would say start here to find out what your community thinks about climate change. Spend some time exploring this tool, select different questions. I think that's a great way to get started. And then the Six Americas, you can definitely read more about the Six Americas. I'll share that as well. And there's just so much on our website. So honestly, it can be kind of overwhelming. But I'm hoping with the links and the slides that, those are good places to kind of start. And then choose your own adventure from there.
I see we have another hand up, Gail. You have a
Hi, yes.
question?
I wrote in the chat, I have an example that I can share with all the people at the libraries from 2019. Just a little bit of background. So I was a contractor for the Navy on the island of Guam, and my job was 100% focused on energy and water management, energy and conservation. So I came up with an outreach event or activities that I did at the library, so at the Navy and the Air Force libraries for their visitors. And the first thing to tell you and to remember, you can look this up, is October in connection with Halloween is Energy Action Month. And if you've ever heard about energy loads, plug loads and things like that, they use the Halloween theme to do vampire loads, if you've heard of vampire or phantom loads, and how to slay the vampires. So I did some activities in which I got a device, and I did this at the libraries in the different events. There's a kind of a plug-in device called a kilowatt meter, and you can plug in different appliances and show kids. You can turn on like a fan or a hair dryer, and you can show what energy consumption is, because they will see the meter showing the amount of energy that's consumed. And I use this in a STEM way. In some cases, I had like middle school classes or high school classes, and I divided the students up into groups, and then they recorded their data that they got and did a comparison at the end of the data between the groups. If you would like, I can show you. I've actually created a flyer about the whole Halloween Energy Action Month, and I can share my screen and show you the flyer, or if anyone is interested in the flyer that I put together, I can put my email in the chat and you can contact me and I'll send you my flyer that I created or any of the other ideas. But I actually did this in the libraries, and instead of giving away like plastic things, the librarians came up with this idea. They said that their visitors really like to do crafts. And so we came up with the idea of getting all the construction paper and crowns and markers together. And we had the students create little signs to take home and hang up that said, like, please turn out the lights. And they could hang this up near the light switches on their walls. So it was to teach the whole family about remembering to turn off lights and to turn things off. So that was another thing that we did with the students, and they got to take those home. So those are just some of the suggestions of the things that I did specifically with libraries and students and things like that. So whatever you prefer, I can show you. If I can share my screen, I can show you the flyer that I made, or I can put my email in the chat and you can contact me, whichever you prefer.
Yeah, if you want to drop your email in the chat, and anybody who's interested can certainly reach out. I think that would be wonderful. Thank you. Are there any other questions anybody has?
I just wanted to say we also have, especially about engaging children, we have a For Educators page on our website that has a bunch of resources for how to teach children about some of the concepts that I talked about today. And there are exercises in there, activities for children to do, to learn about the Six Americas, to use our tools and research. So if that's of interest, please feel free to check that out as well.
Yes, thank you. I'll definitely will be adding the links that were shared in the chat on our website along with the recording and the slides, so everyone can kind of follow up with that. We have about like a minute left, or have a minute left. If anybody else has any questions or comments, feel free to drop it in the chat, or if you want to unmute.
Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you very much, Mallika. We appreciate your time and for everything that you shared with us today. Thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon, and we will see you all very soon. Thanks again, Mallika. This was a pleasure. Wonderful information. Thank you for sharing.
Thank you. Have a great rest of your week. Bye-bye.
You too. Take care.